Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of iPolitics Signature Podcast, No Talking Points. I'm your host, Marco Vigliotti, the editor-in-chief here at iPolitics. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Brian Storseth, our publisher. It's same week, but it's different week, but we got the same terrific group of folks chatting with us. Bahoz Dara Aziz from Navigator, Michel Breau from Wellington Dupont, and Cole Hogan, a conservative strategist. Thank you all for joining us. We have a lot to digest, so I'll just cut to the chase. We had a very big day in Ottawa, but that might just be in this little hill bubble that we seem to all occupy. Bahoz, I'll start with you. What's the gut reaction or the instant reaction, to yesterday's follow-up? Excuse me, I'm gonna tripped up by this all the time. Spring economic statement.
Spring economic statement. Yeah, it's difficult to say. Spring economic update. So
Sorry, yes.
Very new to us. So because for the folks who are listening, the reason why it's a little confusing is we were always so used to fall economic statements and budgets being in the spring. So now we're switching it up. I'm also getting used to it, Marco, in terms of the name. But in terms of the content that we saw, I think it's great. And I think people aren't going to find that to be a surprise by any means. You know, starting off from the top, you have your deficit being $11 billion less than it was expected. I think we're definitely seeing those fiscal restraints and the tightening of the purse strings. And we're seeing that pan out. But second of all, we're seeing, the labeling Canada as one of the second fastest growing economy in the G7, second only to the United States. And we're light years ahead of like nations like Germany and Japan. So we're seeing Canada's economy grow in a very uncertain time, in a time where affordability is obviously a massive issue. And on the note of affordability, we're seeing, affordability measures being put in place. We're seeing the grocery rebate. We're seeing movement on more apartment rental builds. And we're also seeing the workforce being prioritized. I thought that was probably the coolest part of this. Seeing $6 billion going into 100,000 skilled trade workers, ensuring that we get more skilled trade workers, folks who could build more of those homes that we need, and ensuring that we get more young people into the economy. I think these are all really good news, and I'm pretty happy with the spring economic statement.
You're tripping up yourself. You said it was an update. Now it's a statement. When will these liberal
Yeah.
Cole, I assume you're not going to have as a rosy perception of yesterday's events as Bahoz did. Please tell me, what was your big takeaway from yesterday?
Sure. Well, not unlike the both of you, I have to admit my political circadian rhythm is a bit thrown off by having the spring economic updates and then the budget in November again, I assume. So now we're getting used to this new timeline. And, I think they've spaced them out well to be communication devices. So there's a bit more time opposed to, the fall economic statement and then the budget, in which there was a smaller time frame between those two events to get your message out and talk about the stuff you wanted to. Deficit of $11 billion. Good job, I guess. There's still massive debt and deficit to speak of. So there's that. There's that there. The defense spending, I was looking for a bit more of an explanation as towards how we're actually going to pay for that. The $6 billion, I think it was, toward trades training. I think that's great. Anyone that gets, people into the trades in Canada, we need more skilled workers. That's for sure. But I think, we saw the Carney government pre-position itself for news before a budget or an economic update like this, like the Trudeau government used to do. And the Sovereign Wealth Fund was sort of the main story. And I think kind of remains the large story coming out after this update. But the question is, how are you going to fund this? Is this a sovereign wealth fund requires wealth, or a surplus to fund it, and I don't see how they actually have that. It looks like it'll be a deficit-funded wealth redistribution program as far as I can tell, and I'm curious to see how this actually works, because there's been some concern about the fact of governments owning or taking possession of the revenue generated from the natural resource sector in Alberta, which by Section 92 of the Constitution is provincial jurisdiction. And let's keep in mind, there's an Alberta separation referendum coming up in October, and there's an election coming up in Quebec in October as well. So as we push towards these things, if the Sovereign Wealth Fund is used for something like, taking the revenue from provincial resources and the natural resource sector and the federal government seizing that money, that will be a contentious issue heading towards October.
Yeah, that's a good point, Cole. What an interesting time to roll out a sovereign wealth fund when we may have two sovereignty crises on our hands in short order. Michel, what's your read in terms of what happened? Do you agree with Bahoz that it hit all the points it needed to, and it shows we're weathering the storm better, or do you think like Cole, it's leaving a lot of big questions that this government's going to have to answer?
Well, Marco, I guess you didn't introduce me off the top as a former Liberal strategist, so maybe that bodes about how I'm going to tackle this a little bit. I'll say, like Bahoz, I was thrown back, maybe less by the actual timing and a bit more by the title. I guess a FEZ sounds a little bit better than an FEU. That kind of a little bit more weird sounding when they used to be in the fall. I do appreciate just from a good governance standpoint that we actually got the budget motion and the Budget Implementation Act approved before the start of the fiscal year now. And it does actually seem to make sense to have an update at the end of the last fiscal year. So in some ways, this actually maybe seems a bit more sensible than how we were doing it all along. I think in terms of a update versus statement, though, I mean, this was pretty slim. You got the growth fund, or sorry, the Canada Strong Fund, the Team Strong Canada. I'm sure there were 3 or 4 other things that were previously announced that have strong somewhere in the name or build somewhere in the name. But those are really the 2 big things that stuck out to me. A little bit of an update around legislating and expanding some of the powers of the Defense Investment Agency. But I think this was, unlike a lot of the frantic COVID and kind of late Trudeau budgets where, there was just an attempt to placate every political constituency, this actually seems to be someone sticking to plan. And just to Cole's point on kind of how we're paying for the Sovereign Wealth Fund, I would say as a Maritimer, I don't think we ever really minded out east that we were paying for 2 railways and uranium mines and Syncrude and Suncor over the years. So I think that's one of the great things about the Federation is that whenever any region succeeds, they help the entire country get ahead rather than kind of keeping it to themselves.
Yeah, that's a good point, Michel. I had never even thought of referring to the fall economic statement as the fall economic update, and then you have the FEU, which is it's a mess. And what do you read from yesterday's big splashy news day? Seems like even the critics, I think, will acknowledge, and even the supporters, that it wasn't a terribly splashy new item. But I think to Michelle's point, that was kind of the point. This is someone sticking, to the plan that they've, unveiled, trying to point to some points to say, hey, we're actually seeing some success.
Yeah. I mean, look, a reduced deficit is a number at the top line is always a positive for any government at any point in the mandate. But I think the concerns raised by CPA on the government falling short on its expected operational savings is something that needs to be identified. I think we need to keep an eye on how the government is following through on some of the projected savings that it looks to have throughout the year. I mean, the fact of the matter is Q2 average Brent crude oil prices was like averaged over $100 a barrel. That's going to mean significant more dollars in from a revenue perspective. I think we also have to continue to, as the government continues to create new agencies and new alphabet agencies left, right, and center on how to spend our money, we've got to make sure we're continuing to hold them to account on the savings side of it as well.
Yeah. But does it matter? Like, can I just be blunt here? I saw the fiscal horizon numbers that they threw out. By 2031, they're still projecting that they're going to run a $53 billion deficit. That's higher than most Trudeau era deficits. Are we in the era where these numbers get thrown out, but because of the trade war, obviously we were dealing with COVID, so I think there's a lot less sensitivity around how big the deficit was. But it seems like we're in this weird world where everyone just accepts we're running deficits. The numbers don't seem to terribly faze anyone. At the end of the day, is this really resonating with people if you take a message that we need to start cutting spending?
I guess the question is, do these numbers, these massive, massive numbers resonate with regular everyday people at home? I think that's a likely a no, because the reality is most of us have never seen, $1 billion or $1 million, let alone $1 billion, right? So those numbers aren't something that would resonate to the normal person. But what I think does resonate is it's clear that this government is looking to tighten the purse strings. It's clear that they're looking to save and to reduce waste and to reduce any sort of cost inefficiencies. We're seeing that with what they're doing with the federal bureaucracy, but we're also seeing the investments going into the right place. And I think these 2 components are what will really hit well at home for people, where it's not only are you, similar to me, reducing your budget, similar to every other Canadian who has to reduce their budget currently, but you're also making wiser investments and ensuring that your priorities are in the right place, right? So, I think folks talked a little bit about the agencies that are in the government, now the new agencies. So instead of having a very bloated public service, they've minimized the public service and they're reprioritizing the areas that need to see things through as quickly as possible. District office, for example, right? It's instead of having a variety of bureaucrats all along, we're going to have this very specialized office to get major projects through as quickly as possible to ensure that Canada and Canadians reap the benefits as fast as possible.
I know you're talking about. Sorry, go ahead, Brian.
I agree with the theory, and it sounds good. My question is, are they actually reducing the bloated bureaucracy? My
understanding is yes.
The numbers that were put out yesterday don't show that they're hitting their own targets for those numbers, right? And that's because I agree with everything you're saying. My concern is, are we actually hitting those numbers? Are we talking about it? And then finding that we can't actually get the investments to where they want to go in the major projects that the government is putting forward, and then having to create another agency or another wealth fund so that we can actually get the money where it needs to go.
Right. I mean, my viewpoint on this, and I think, all of us have some level of deep experience with government and bureaucracy and just how slow and how tough it is to kind of move past these major walls that are, I was at immigration for a while. And so it was tough. We had some really great bureaucrats, and that's as far as I'll go with that. But ultimately, there was a lot of slowness, right? There was a lot of delay. There was a lot of, this, it's always been this way. And it's hard for anybody, even Mark Carney, to get past that. So I think, yes, there probably will face challenges. I think no matter who is prime minister, will face those very deep challenges. But I think we're seeing where the priorities lay, and we're seeing where they're headed. And I feel like it's a very optimistic picture. And I think a pretty, if I can say, maybe a brave one, because I think most people wouldn't have gone so quick and so hard at the public service so fast.
Yeah, I think if I could just add on, I think that Mark Carney is, well, one, he's experiencing what it's like to run into the Ottawa industrial system, so to speak. The speed of government is a real thing, and it's glacial. And even Mark Carney can't make it move faster than he would like. But in regards to the spring economic update, there is a gap here in terms, and there's a political weakness, I would say, in terms of addressing the cost of living and affordability issues. There's nothing in here that really speaks to making life more affordable for Canadians generally. And, look around. For younger Canadians in particular, rent is $2,500. A house is $1 million, 1.5 if you're in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal. Like, where's the relief for this? Enough houses aren't being built. I think I saw at the tail end of last year, there was maybe about 7,000 houses that were built. So we're way off of our targets. And I think that this is a blind spot for Mark Carney and the Liberal government, something that they're trying to address. But I think as time goes on, this is where they're going to be squeezed a bit, because there's some big headline stuff that catches a lot of news, like the Sovereign Wealth Fund, but how are actually Canadians benefiting on a day-to-day basis beyond, GST off groceries, so you can maybe save $100 a year. There needs to be bigger, more immediate relief for everyday people.
So, Marco, to go back to your original question on does the debt or deficit matter? I mean, at the end of the day, it does. I think Liberals and Conservatives still agree on that. At a certain point, as we saw in the 90s, as we saw in Europe a decade ago, if you let your debt get too high, it is going to start to impact your ability to borrow, and you're going to start having interest charges eat up where your actual your revenue sources are going. Canada's nowhere near that. I mean, there's the old phrase in politics, don't judge me against the almighty, judge me against the alternative. And if you look at the balance sheet Canada has, it's still in phenomenal shape compared to the rest of the world, even when you factor in provinces. I think a lot of people looking at the headline numbers don't realize that, unlike a lot of our peers, the CPP assets on the balance sheet aren't actually included in kind of the headline 40% debt to GDP ratio, like they would be in a lot of European countries where that's a government-run pension program. That said, I think the government also needs to be a little bit better on some of the workforce adjustment they're doing. When I first showed up in Ottawa, there were literally file cabinets upon file cabinets full of paper, and you'd have them, public servants that literally were paid to print off an email and then retype it in a different file. That doesn't necessarily make any sense. But when it comes to affordability, I mean, at the end of the day, unless you're just going to start having massive lump sum transfer programs or subsidies or what have you, and I think a lot of bulk in the public service isn't just efficiency. It was also a lot of very niche programs that the Trudeau government started to play a bit of whack-a-mole with in order to try to keep their poll numbers around back when they started to slip a little bit. At the end of the day, that comes through economic growth, but also it doesn't necessarily all come from the federal government. If you look at things like housing, if you look at things like training skilled workers to have jobs with good wages, that's squarely on the backs of the provinces. Almost all of them, last time I checked, are not necessarily the same political stripe as Carney. So I think, for the last 5-6 years, it's always been, what's Trudeau doing? What's Carney doing to fix the economy? I mean, what's Doug Ford doing on housing prices? What's Scott Moe doing on skilled trades? What's Danielle Smith doing on the price of groceries? I think we need to be asking those questions to the premiers as well.
Do you think, Michelle, though, that focus is going to shift? Because obviously Trudeau became a lightning rod of criticism, especially on things like housing. Do you think the fact that Carney maybe has a bit more of a honeymoon period right now, that he maybe won't kind of become the center point of all that criticism on those issues? So to your point, a lot of this stuff is done on the provincial level, but I feel like it was really irrelevant back in 2024. Trudeau was the problem for everything was the person responsible for every ill facing his country.
So, I mean, I think that was a massive problem. And you had back when you had Chrétien and Martin, you had your more human face the government in Chrétien, and you had your Bay Street person in Martin. That ran into problems once it was just the Martin show. And Trudeau was not the Bay Street person, and the government never really developed that key set of economic voices. Trudeau kind of had to step up and do it. And then on the flip side, they tried to make Freeland, who was maybe a little bit more suited for that type of academic intellectual conversation, try to be the populist messenger at finance. And that didn't work. I think Carney is what he is. I think he needs to be careful because there's been chatter recently about, what's he doing for workers? What's he doing for families? That's not why he was elected. If you cared about affordability in the last election, you voted for Pierre Poilievre. If you voted for Mark Carney, you cared about Canada-US relations, about good governance, about having kind of a steady hand at the tiller. That's what he's delivering. The Angus Reid numbers out a couple of days ago. Yeah, he's not met people's expectations on affordability, but he wasn't elected to address affordability. He was elected to kind of keep things safe and stable until the global geopolitical and economic environment gets a little bit more advantageous to Canada.
Well, you're go for it.
I would follow up and just ask, what happens when Mark Carney can't address tariffs and Donald Trump and doesn't get a deal? And also Canadians are facing ever increasing rents and home prices. If you fail on the main thing you were elected to do, and then what are we measuring Mark Carney against? He also said you can judge me by the prices at the grocery stores. If nothing changes on this front and he actually can't get a deal with Donald Trump and the United States and nothing really manifests here, then the whole reason you were elected was for naught. So does that not impact Mark Carney's electoral chances in the next election? And I understand Donald Trump will probably still be president when the next Canadian election happens, and that's to the Liberals' advantage, but they're going to have something to prove, something to show for their time in government domestically as well.
Brian, what do you think about that? Do you think there's something that they need to deliver if they can't secure a win with Canada-US?
Sorry, was that for me, Marco?
Sorry, did I just get chopped out? It was for whoever wanted it.
Look, I'm happy to take it. At the end of the day, I think there's a perception gap here too. Like Mark Carney, when people, especially older Canadians, look at Mark Carney, they see the right person for the job right now. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue that when you look at the poll numbers and you look at the opposition absolutely terrified to go to an election the last 6 months. Mark Carney appears to have the right background. He appears to have the right temperament. He seems to talk the way that Canadians are looking for right now, I would say. That my concern is not so much that Mark Carney doesn't know what he's doing. My concern is, in some ways, is that he absolutely knows what he's doing and has, doesn't seem like he's Justin Trudeau, but he certainly has an ideological perspective that the government can and should pick winners and losers. The difference is now with the Sovereign Wealth Fund is the government's going to take a cut out of picking the winners and losers and Canadians and foreign investors along the way as well. So at the end of the day, I think it's two different visions for the country, but certainly people do seem to be okay with the vision that Mark Carney's putting forward at this point in time.
And Marco, I think to Cole's point, I would say there's a real politic that needs to be acknowledged here. If you were going to be upset by the prices at the grocery store in a year or so, you probably already are, and you probably already were a year ago, and you probably did not vote for Mark Carney. Or you're potentially someone who voted for Mark Carney over Jagmeet Singh, and you're going to be the extra 5% that maybe lets the NDP get their deposit back in a bunch of 416 ridings. So I don't think politically there's going to be that much of a shift, because frankly, it's a bit of a tough argument for Conservatives to at the same time say we want a smaller government, but it should do more for people. I think there's a bit of a hard, and I mean, respect to Conservative messaging specialists who may be able to land it like Cole in various circumstances, but I think it's hard for a conservative narrative like that to work in the campaign. And I think at the end of the day, Carney can kind of quite cautiously and pragmatically try to say, let me just keep enough of the electorate in enough places that I can stick around this majority until conditions change, and I'm able to maybe start showing the dividends of a lot of the growth that he's trying to start catalyzing, to use the word of the year.
So I don't feel like I agree with 90% of what was just said. So I'm gonna hop in real quick. I do think affordability is important. I think any anybody who's ever been in politics ever would say that affordability is important. Pocketbook issues are, the bread and butter of elections, are the bread and butter of what people care about. And ultimately, yes, of course, there's this more macro, more existential issue that we're all dealing with in terms of Canada's sovereignty, and that's something that's very important. But ultimately, like, we also care about, getting our kids to soccer practice or like putting food on the table. Those things matter so much. And I don't agree to say that the government has just, put those aside and are focusing on, international relations. I think that these things all go hand in hand and things stack up, right? So it takes a little bit of time. And I agree, like, listen, relief should have been on the way earlier, but they're doing their best and they're trying to get relief to Canadians as soon as possible. But these sort of measures will stack up and will ensure that Canadians are feeling relief. We want to talk about the spring economic update. Again, like, talk about the grocery rebate, talk about the $7 billion that went into 16,500 apartment rentals. Those things, yes, of course, more people than 16,500 people and their families need housing, but it's where we're starting and it's where we're pushing things forward and it's where the priorities lay. And I also think making Canada a richer economy will ensure better economic opportunity for Canadians who are currently here and who need work. So even the skilled worker program, the Canada Strong Team, that is ensuring that people are not only going into the trades that we require to build Canada, but it's also ensuring that they get paid and they get experience. So to say that affordability issues have been put off to the side, I think is for me completely inaccurate. And I think that for Prime Minister Mark Carney and for his team and a lot of the folks that I know there, they're acutely aware that pocketbook issues matter so deeply to people, that affordability matters so deeply to people. We can sit here and say we have a deal with Trump, and if that did happen, and that everything is great. But ultimately, if like someone can't pay their mortgage, it's not going to work. And I think people know that. And so I think it's something that they're definitely working towards. And I did see, maybe we're reading two different spring economic updates. I saw affordability measures in that document.
I agree with Bahoz. The affordability is going to be an important issue.
Like,
I just don't think 1.5% growth rate's very good, and it's not good enough to continue to move us forward. There's different ways to couch it, and certainly it's better than Germany's, and certainly it's better than other countries that don't have the boon of the oil and gas sector in the middle of a Middle East crisis. But I think, look, I give Mark Carney credit that he had the courage of his convictions. He wanted a majority government so that he could put his vision forward for the country. To Cole's point, we're all going to now have a couple of years to let that play out and see if going in and picking 6 or 7 or 8 or 10 projects across the country is going to have the economic boon and help the affordability crisis that Canadians and young people are in, or if it's going to only continue to exacerbate the situation. But at least Mark Carney, I give him credit. He had the courage of his convictions to say, this is what I want. And I think you're actually seeing more of what his vision is now that he has a majority government.
And on Canada-US, I want to shift gears a bit. We had a bit of a interesting week with, it seems like there's two very, very different messages coming from Washington and Ottawa about the status of negotiations. But, I think we are left with this perception that Canada is in no rush to come to the table. I think the Prime Minister is trying to send the message that, hey, I'm on top of this. I know the Americans are hemming and hawing, but don't worry, we have this vision here. I'll start with you, Cole. Is that going to work out? Like, or is there too much anxiety around this issue to give the Prime Minister that much bandwidth? Or does he have, the support of the public? Poll after poll shows he's doing pretty well. Do people trust him to maybe take his time and to get us in the position where we can secure the best possible deal?
Yes, they do. Like, undoubtedly, the Canadian public trusts Mark Carney to deal with Donald Trump and tariffs. Like, politically, there's no spinning that. They just do. They trust him to do it. I think even if everything goes topsy-turvy and the world's upside down when dealing with Jameson Greer or any sort of Trump administration appointee or individual, they do trust Mark Carney, even if nothing makes sense and we have no real sense of the negotiating strategy. And I do understand, like, the liberal defense of not negotiating in public, because you shouldn't. Like, that makes sense. I understand that line. But I think there's some confusion in terms of what sort of deal we're looking for. And I know that they don't want to have that. This is our objective. I think the minute that you outline a firm objective from the government's perspective, then that's when it gets blown to pieces. So if you have it just wide open and we're doing our best to get a deal, you have Don LeBlanc out there, you have the new Canada-US Relations Advisory Committee with Lisa Rates, John Charest on there again, and Aaron O'Toole. So I think that there's some political cover for them as well. And I want to see what sort of form that conversation takes. But, eventually you're going to have to show some form of result on this if you want to go back to the ballot box and back to the Canadian public with any strong showing.
So, Margaret, just to jump in there as well, and I'll say just on the previous conversation, I'm not saying affordability isn't an important issue to a lot of Canadians. I'm just saying I think it's wise of Mark Carney to not try to win a ballot box issue. He's probably destined to lose. And I think, whether it's affordability or Canada US, as Cole was saying, I mean, I think there is a very prudent point being made in some parts of the Liberal Party that the longer Carney waits, yes, there's a downside risk whenever you call an early election, but the longer he waits, the more things could go wrong. And right now things are going pretty well. So if you think about it just from a pure strategy standpoint, the sooner he's able to extend his mandate, the more likely he's probably going to be about being successful. Because I don't necessarily think when you look at another, more than 2.5 years of Trump, and kind of the continued global, both economic and political situation, Canada might not actually be in a happier, more comfortable place in 2.5 years than it is, say, in a month or in 6 months. When it comes to Canada and the US, though, at the end of the day, it's about keeping alliance at bay. We aren't going to end up getting a deal from Trump that A, we can rely on, or B, that's going to be advantageous to us. So I was actually kind of quite impressed in the spring economic statement. They said it was something like 35% boost to non-US goods exports in literally a year. Like you can see on the graph, there's a huge spike in Q1 last year when everyone was trying to get their stuff into the US before tariffs hit. And then literally this takeoff of Canada exporting elsewhere. I think, frankly, one of the underrated stories around the Canada table is Trade Minister Mani Sidhu. I think for the first time in a while, after getting the kind of Canada-Europe, Canada the CPP, TPP trade deals out of the way, is actually trying to knock off some more individual level deals. Indonesia, there's the talks with India, there's the talks with UAE, there's Mercosur back. I actually think that's one of the places maybe a bit overlooked in terms of the spring economic statement, where the government's actually starting to produce results for what it's doing, and that Carney can directly tie back to the platform he ran on in the last election.
I'm curious, because to Michelle's point, I hear what you're saying, but it does seem like there was a shift, whereas right out the gate, PM came out there and said, we're going to try to get a deal by this date. Didn't happen. There was that big push in the fall, fell apart. It feels like Mark Carney's being a bit more comfortable saying, yeah, Doug Ford kind of, screwed me over there. But, I just wonder about why have we seen that shift, or maybe I'm just perceiving things are incorrect, where we had this big push to kind of get a deal, didn't get one, and now we seem to be kind of refocusing and re-strategizing and now trying to, maybe deflect a bit of attention from the Canada-US file.
Because negotiations are complex, especially when you're dealing with somebody who is complex and unpredictable and uncertain. And I think that Mark Carney, and I promise I'm not just here to compliment this man, but I believe he's a good negotiator, and I believe that this is a part of the tactic that we're moving forward with, right? So in a lot of negotiations, you come in good faith, and you come in and you try to get something done together. But when the other party doesn't seem to be at the table in the same sort of good faith, I think then you have to reestablish and reevaluate what you're doing. And I think that's exactly what we did. And I think, to be clear, I don't fully agree with I hate saying this, I sound like a conservative. I don't agree with the premise of the question. I don't think that we're just sitting around and waiting. I don't think that that's where things are at. Conversations between Canada and the US are still happening. Dom LeBlanc is still having conversations with his counterparts. Conversations on the varying working levels are still occurring. And even Jameson Greer said he wants to get us, a negotiation going. What isn't happening, as you've said, is there isn't a conversation between leaders. And I think if there isn't a willing participant in the President of the United States, it doesn't make sense for Mark Carney to be out there pleading for his attention and his time. I think it makes sense for him to be out there creating deals and ensuring that the Canadian economy is on the up and up, and that we're not just solely putting all of our eggs in one basket. So I think that it's a two-pronged strategy. I think we have the strategy of how do we deal with the US, and we're dealing with it. And we've also created, as Cole said, advisory council. And then it's also ensuring that we have that global footprint, and we're creating allies, and we're convening folks and having conversations with our allies, and ensuring that we're getting more investment through our allies and bringing Canada's economy up that way. And also Canada's international standing, because these are conversations. These are a component of allyship, and ensuring that we have people to back us up, and then we're able to have similar values and viewpoints when coming to the table.
But listen, Marco, like the old maxim is true. No plan survives contact with the enemy. One of my favorite kind of takedowns in politics was at one point a couple decades ago when Stephen Colbert said of George Bush, he believes the same thing on Monday as Wednesday, no matter what happened Tuesday. So I think when conditions change, which is making contact with the enemy, Carney getting into the new role, having conversations directly with the president, getting briefed by officials, there's needed to be a pivot. And right now, in the laws of political physics, Trump is a massive, massive center of gravity that is pulling everything inwards towards kind of the chaotic core of the mega Trump world, if you will. And it takes a lot of energy to just keep things in orbit at a safe distance from everything that's going on there. And I think the other thing that's important to think about in kind of foreign affairs and international relations too, is we're all used to the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month political cycle. When you look at most of the world, they view foreign relations on a year-to-year, decade-to-decade level. So when you talk about actually shifting policy, I mean, Trump's blown up kind of that concept of, countries generally maintain the same policies over time. But I think when it comes to an approach, whether it's international trade, we're moving quite a bit faster than I think people would generally assume you can on trade. And same thing with diplomacy. You don't want to go too far ahead, because as you are looking to strengthen your relations or gradually shift your position, you need to give all of your partners confidence that you're not just going to do a 180 and pivot to something different in 6 months. So some of that stuff does take a little bit more time than I think the domestic political landscape is used to handling.
I'd want to hear from you, Marco and Brian. You guys just had the ambassador on your show. That's a big get. I want to hear what your thoughts are.
That you start.
Well, first of all, Marco had the ambassador on as he's the star, and it was a great show. Look, I think you could rephrase that initial question. Maybe Doug Ford didn't ruin the deal for Mark Carney. Maybe he saved him from making a bad deal. And Mark Carney has, as he stepped back, realized that, because I think at the end of the day, this is all one strategy, right? I think going and deleveraging yourself from your largest trading partner is part of the strategy. You need deals with other countries to do that. I think one of the probably standouts that I've seen in the last year was canola, especially after China hit a tariff. We actually exported more canola around the world by getting out there to other places in the world and seeing who would take our canola. So I think at the end of the day, this is all the same strategy moving forward. I think that Mark Carney is, he is probably looking at this from a perspective of, as Michel said, is it really beneficial to get anything done with Donald Trump, especially in the near term where Trump's desperately looking for wins? But at the end of the day, this is going to be an interesting one, because I'm hearing from Americans that Canada is the one stalling these deals at this point in time. So it's all part of a bigger plan. I just think it's going to take those of us watching it a little bit of time to see where it comes together at and how it unfolds.
Yeah, I was a bit taken aback, because honestly, when you disagreed with my framing of a question, it just reminded me of back when you were on the Hill. Got a bit of, but I think Brian's 100% accurate in terms of the messaging from the Americans. And this is why I kind of framed that question that way. The Americans are saying, we want to talk, let's get to the table. And they're blaming the Canadians for not doing so. And from everything the Prime Minister said, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like he's saying, well, we're doing what we need to do to help succeed in this negotiation, which is basically signaling, yeah, we're not going to talk to someone who's putting forward some unreasonable demands where we don't think there's an opportunity or a potential to succeed. So this is part of our strategic play. And I think Cole, that's why I asked Cole that question. If we do play the waiting game, Canadians have faith in Mark Carney. I think Cole was saying, yeah, they do. And I think poll after poll kind of suggests that. So the Americans are saying, you guys are stalling on us. And I don't think Carney's disagreeing. I'll let Michel and Bahoz follow up on that one. But it seems like he's saying, yeah, we're waiting for a reason, guys. There's no one to talk to. We're not going to get a good deal. So that's what the strategy is. Just bear with me. And it seems like people are doing it, at least right now.
Well, I mean, Marco, if you look at the spring economic statement, it's come down a little bit over the last year, but it's still, I think, 85% of goods trade with the U.S. is tariff-free. The effective tariff rate is 5%, but it's still one of the best in the world. So, I mean, again, comparing Canada against where else we could be, things are pretty good. I think whether it's, whatever side of the whole Doug Ford ad question you might land on, at the end of the day, getting a bit too much attention from the U.S. under Trump has proven not to necessarily be advantageous in terms of your relationship and your negotiating position. So I think keeping your head down, unless there's something that is a smart strategic move, makes a lot of sense. And at the end of the day, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both in terms of Canada's positioning on these talks. To one extent, are we playing hard to get in order to try to make ourselves seem a little bit more attractive, in order to try to, get them to come and woo us, get a bit of a better deal? Sure. Are we also maybe playing a bit hard to get because we're not really that interested in what's on the table right now, and we just wish they would kind of buzz off? That might also be a little bit of the case too. At the end of the day, though, I think until there's a pressure for Trump Trump always chickens out, until he's up against wanting to just get a deal in at all costs, no matter what he says or what the facts on the ground are. I don't really think there's a situation where it's beneficial for Canada to make concessions or accept a worse off deal, because ultimately that's just going to lower the ceiling in terms of what we could potentially get in terms of a longer term kind of 2.0 relationship with the US.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in here. There's never been, the Liberals can move the goalposts on the issue of Trump and tariffs at any given time. Like the new Liberal support base is Ontario boomers for the most part, and they are captivated by this issue. Like anyone over 60 is really consumed by the issue of Trump and tariffs. They watch a lot of American news. They watch a lot of traditional media, and they're kind of willing to go along with anything that talks about Trump and takes it on in a real way, even if they're not really addressing the issue. We saw Mark Carney and the Liberal government blow past a lot of self-imposed deadlines. So I think they're not doing that anymore because I think they're thinking to themselves, we need flexibility on this issue because people trust us. So let's keep it alive as long as possible, because that's what their base and their core voters, like that's their main preoccupation. It's the main thing they care about. They're going to have no problem keeping that issue alive.
But Cole, I guess I'll turn the question on you. Do the Conservatives, are they going to fall into a potential trap here where they're trying to get criticizing Mark Carney on this front? It seems like they're almost kind of playing this card where they're like, hey, don't run away from the Americans right now. And, I think, you would know better than I would that messaging of like, let's actually come to the table and let's be a bit more open and receptive to the Americans might not be terribly politically popular. Like, are Conservatives going to fall into a trap where they're saying Carney Liberals can attack them as being the pro-American party right now?
Yeah, so there's a couple interesting things at play here. Like, for whatever it's worth, and your mileage may vary on how you think like it actually went, but when Poilievre was doing Joe Rogan and the Diary of a CEO podcast, he was talking about the fact that, 50s need Canadian aluminum to be built. And he was talking about the cross-border relationship that's needed to produce a lot of goods that Americans need. I think that is sort of like, here's the relationship we need to maintain that benefits both of the Canadian and American economy. So I think that's a good message. But like the main differentiating thing here to your question is that Poilievre seems to be saying, like, we cannot just run away from this relationship entirely. There cannot be a permanent rupture. And Mark Carney saying there's an irreversible rupture. We can never go back to the way things were. And, there's some merit to both arguments. But this is the tricky part, right? Because when we were in a minority status not too long ago, the Liberals were voting with the Conservatives on a lot of things. They voted on Bill C-5 to get the major projects office up and running and approve energy projects, immigration, crime, bail reform bills. Like there was a lot of, they voted in favor of a couple tax bills as well. So there was a lot of, and I wonder, it remains to be seen if this will continue, but there was a lot of cross the aisle cooperation as related to just getting any sort of relief for Canadians. Just like, the Liberals need to handle the Trump and tariffs issue. Like that's the main thing they have to deal with. And I would argue they also need to make some domestic gains and put some wins in the window to demonstrate, the ability to do so. The Conservatives also, while leading on some issues like I would say immigration, crime, affordability, and pocketbook issues, they need to have a more cohesive message to talk about Donald Trump and the United States. And with the Conservatives on the Canada-US Advisory Committee and voting with the Liberals on some matters as it relates to getting some relief for Canadians and dealing with the states, that's the tricky part because we're kind of voting for a lot of their things, a lot of their measures as it relates to the Canada-US fight here, for lack of a better term. But like, how do they differentiate themselves on this issue? And it's kind of tricky because there's the Team Canada approach until there isn't, right?
What Marco, I'll to compliment a conservative, because again, apparently I'm being a little bit obnoxious to type this podcast. I do think Poilievre, I didn't watch the full Diary of a CEO, but when you look at Rogan, when you look even at the press gallery dinner bit that Poilievre did, I think things were moving in the right direction there in terms of how he was trying to get Canadians to see him. Frankly, whoever was doing the comms for that, I hope he does whatever he can to grab that person, hug them close, lock them down, because that was really on a roll. I don't know what happened the last month or so on his comm side. But I think this re-embrace of the more kind of very pro-MAGA part of the Conservative Party to shore up the base, to shore up fundraising, to shore up his leadership, what have you, is a bit of a calculation that there's not going to be an election anytime soon. This doesn't really matter in the long run. And at the end of the day, preserve the ballot box fight between Canada-US versus affordability for whenever that does come. And I think, again, the Carney folks need to be a bit wary that, right now you can call Poilievre out on that and probably get a healthy endorsement and a pretty solid long-term majority that's not a couple seats and a couple floor crossers. Whereas down the road, you let memories fade a little bit, and there's the opportunity, not on Canada-US, but even just let the Conservatives flip the ballot box issue back on an affordability basis if the Trump issue at some point hits a low ebb.
I also want to jump in real quick here. Like, Mark Carney and Donald Trump are buddies. Like, they're clearly friendly and have like a positive relationship. So sometimes I observe a bit of a reality distortion field where it's like, yeah, Mark Carney's going to give it to the Republicans and Donald Trump, but they actually have a close, like, working relationship. Sometimes I observe the gap with this with concern, because we seem to be able to, fight the Americans, but also Carney has a very positive working relationship with them that we also respected. And the gap sometimes is interesting to me.
Well, I think that's a good point. It was something, though, that was brought up every time we have this conversation around Detroit. Oh, they get along well. They're texting. Trump's so complimentary. Like, is that not just all like Trump style? Like, he'll be nice to you to your face, and then 2 a.m. on Truth Social, and suddenly you're governor again. Like, can we really trust that Trump's friends with anyone? Like, I don't know. Like, I'm not trying to be facetious here, but like, should we really take that guy at face value?
Well, I just really quickly here. During the election, Donald Trump said that, like, I don't like the conservative guy. He's no friend of mine. I would much prefer if the liberal, referring to Mark Carney, got elected. And if we were playing by the supposed, Canadian hatred of Americans, we'd be like, what? Donald Trump likes Mark Carney? I don't like that. He hates the conservative guy? Well, yeah, let's put in a more adversarial figure because we want to fight the Americans. But that didn't matter at all. So to your point, I think that, like, no one really trusts what Donald Trump says. So even when it comes to Canadian politics, it's just kind of like scrambled into a static-based view of the world where nothing he says really matters or can be torqued to high heaven whenever needed.
Yeah, I think Canadians are smarter than believing in that, and I think they understand that the pleasantries that are presented at the White House or the Oval Office are probably very different than the conversations that happen behind the scenes in terms of CUSMA.
Well, it's also what they expect, right? But who's like, nobody expects them to go get in a fist fight with Donald Trump in the Oval Office.
At least not yet.
Yeah.
Well, and Marco, I think something that increasingly, as the political world becomes people who've consumed their entire lives with it, and I think, I'm definitely a culprit. I'm sure there's others on the podcast that are a culprit. But I think when you get out of it a little bit, like I can remember my first time leaving the Hill and then going back into it in a parliamentary affairs setting, you understand how to work with people you don't agree with. So whether you look at Carney and Trump, or Scott Moe, or Doug Ford, or Danielle Smith, he does have an ability that I think we have lost in politics to be able to get along with people you are either directly at odds with or at least fundamentally disagree with. And I think a lot of the kind of current generation of folks that came up through campus clubs and as interns and staffers and then straight into elected positions sometimes remember that in the real world, you can't just have, a permanent lifestyle war against your supposed adversaries. You actually have to try to get the job you're supposed to be doing done.
Yeah, no.
I would just throw out there, though, Michel, Pierre's problem is the people he's not getting along with are all too often leaders of the conservative movement, right? Like on Canada, US, I mean, former Prime Minister Harper came out and said himself, he was the first, I'm a big Harper fan, obviously, but he was the first one to say before Carney, before Pierre talked on it, that Canada-US relations, where are important, are not going to go back to where they once were. So for Pierre to be pushing a different message, it puts him at odds with his own base. You've got the Premier of Saskatchewan flying on all these international trade missions, complimenting the Prime Minister when he's done. You've got the Premier of Alberta undermining that at times, and Doug Ford is always undermining it. So it is difficult for Pierre to get his footing when oftentimes the people that you're at odds with are leaders in your own base.
We got to get Doug Ford on this podcast.
He's been down to come on. He's been calling me, being like, "Why having me on the pod?"
Well, if you guys would all acknowledge and save Carney from a bad deal, we might have a chance here.
There you go.
I mean, Marco, just keep in mind that drive from Toronto to Ottawa is really, really long. I mean, without a plane, it might be really tough for him to get here on site.
Brian, we can subsidize one of those.
Without a plane or a tunnel, Marco.
Just wait.
A walk.
Etobicoke is on the far side of downtown from Ottawa.
We're kind of hitting a bit of a ceiling here in terms of time, so I don't want to drag this on too much longer. So what we do at the end of each show is we kind of talk. I give everyone an opportunity to talk about things that they're either looking forward to or something that they thought was important that just happened the week past. I'll start with you, Cole. Let's What was something that you're either looking ahead to or something that you want to know from the week that just happened?
Sure. So next week, the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference, formerly known as the Manning Conference, will be in Ottawa from May 6th to 9th. Myself and some of the other folks and contributors to Without Diminishment, the conservative platform online, we'll have a panel on the first day. We have one of the opening slots at 9 a.m. So, if you're up and at 'em that early at the convention, we'll be there speaking. A lot of conservatives across the country coming to the conference here in Ottawa. The conservative situation across the country looks a lot different than it did a year ago, obviously. So there'll be a lot of interesting conversations about where we go next. And, all eyes are kind of on BC right now with the British Columbia conservative leadership race and the upcoming election. So that's what I've got my eyes on next for next week.
Yeah, sounds like an interesting event. I'll definitely catch your panel. How about you, Michelle?
So, we just had the spring economic update, but I think there's another event a month out that's worth keeping eyes on, which is CANSEC, which is Canada's leading defense industry conference. That's always been big, but I think hasn't necessarily been on the political radar in downtown Ottawa the way it likely will be this year. And I think the particular tie into that is, in addition to the wealth fund and the skills training, I think the other big piece of the spring economic update was the commitment to legislate the Defense Investment Agency into being and to do some substantial, it sounds like, amendments to the Defense Production Act. If you actually dig into that act, that's literally designed for the government to be able to manage industry in wartime. So the ceiling on what potential changes could go there, I think is pretty big. It'll be interesting to see how timid versus ambitious the government goes. We have subs, we have fighter jets, we have helicopters. There was just an announcement about corvettes. There's speculation about new kind of training and patrol ships. There's long-range strike. There's artillery. There's a lot of decisions to be made. So I think that legislation and the kind of timing and rollout through to CANSEC and then through the NATO summit in Turkey a month or so after, it's going to be interesting to see if the government can finally just start making the decision on a lot of these files, because I think they're starting to run out of a little bit of timeline with Canadians and with industry in terms of actually landing on what the path forward is if they want to spend the money and get to their defense targets in the timeline they've committed to.
Yeah, it's going to be a busy month of May for Ottawa shows or convention events. How about you, Bahoz?
So funny, which I feel like showcases just that me and Michelle are liberal nerds, because I was going to say the same thing. I was so thrilled to see, I swear, I was so thrilled to see that that defense procurement's becoming its own ministry. I'm really excited to figure out what that means. I'm assuming they haven't confirmed it, but I assume that Stephen Fuhrer is going to be the person that's leading it. He's been doing a fantastic job, and he has 20 years as an air pilot himself. So I'm really interested to see how that moves forward, how that progresses our goals in terms of defense spending and showcases Canada's standing on the world stage. So that I think is going to be phenomenal. But since Michelle did take that, I will say something else and maybe a bit more partisan. I'm excited to see how the Conservatives go. I'm excited to see how things progress for them and how Pierre Poilievre either hangs on positively and seamlessly or with a lot of struggle and with maybe a death by a thousand cuts. I'm intrigued to see how the party, those around him, and, seeing that more moderate conservative grouping move towards Carney and maybe even support Carney. As Brian was saying, you have these premiers that are, going around the world touting how great Carney is. I want to see how those implications play out and how that impacts Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party of Canada as a whole, because from what I'm seeing, they don't have anybody waiting in the wings and they don't really have anybody else to replace him currently. So it's like, is he going to finally be able to adapt to a new way of being, or is it going to be, same old, which is what we've been seeing?
How about you, Brian?
Well, I'm not sure if I said that Premier Mo said the Mark Carney was great, but
not in so many words, Brian, but that's what.
But it seems as you both stole my CANSEC piece as well, and I'm not a liberal nerd with it. But
My God.
I am interested. I've had a tweeter tell me that Premier Ford may be making an arrival at CANSEC, so I think I'm interested to see how the provinces start interlaying their public policy moving forward and some of their growth strategy with what the federal government is doing. So I think it's going to be a big month here in Ottawa with everything going on. And I'm also very interested to see who Marco's next guest is on the No Talking Points podcast. I think he's got another one coming up. So
yeah, I was going to say you guys all had some thoughtful intervention. I'm just going to be a shameless plug and say tomorrow we'll be recording our new special podcast. I have a terrific guest. I won't spill the beans just yet, but I can tell you it will likely go live early next week. Will it be as splashy as Mr. Hawkster? I think so. I think it will get some attention. So please stay tuned for that. And yeah, and I'm just really excited to see how the podcast has grown. And of course, thank you all for joining us in this terrific show. And I look forward to chatting with you all very, very soon. So for all you listening, thanks for staying with us. We'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks.
Thanks, Marco.
Thank
Bye,
you.
guys.